is Scalable Code. And I title it Structuring Your Notebooks for Scalable Performance. And what that means is if you want your code to be scalable, you want it to handle an increase in data volume and any kind of changes like that, and then also maintain the performance and efficiency while doing it. So this presentation is going to cover the pieces that you'll need to understand: how to write scalable code with Spark, what does that mean when code scales well, why some things don't, and then what are some best practices and ideas to help you reach your end goals efficiently. So some of the terms that I'm going to mention in this presentation, you probably heard them before: scalable, what I just mentioned. We're also going to talk a little bit about partitions, execution plan, and lazy evaluation. So keep an eye out for those. I have a little bit of, I'm going to make these mentions super quick because I packed a lot into this presentation as usual. Serverless compute: whenever you're running a notebook, check up here frequently to make sure that you're still connected to the compute that you expect, that you think you should be connected to, the one that you created. It really wants to connect to serverless for everything. So just check. There's a link here. And then a quick checklist of, check the compute, confirm it's yours. You may need to restart and reattach, rerun your setup cells. And if you don't know how to, or you haven't done it yet, here is a link also in this notebook to how to create your personalized dedicated compute. And then the second kind of housekeeping message is to something that I'm going to touch on later in this presentation. It's relevant to what we're talking about. Whenever you're doing your development work on your notebook, or maybe you're looking at it after a quarter or a year to rerun some things, and you need to check that all your stuff is working, everything is as expected, you use your interactive personal compute, is what we recommend, with a subset of data to do all your development. And then you can easily develop your code, and you can display all of the intermediate steps that you may have created, any kind of checks, inspecting little things here and there, counts and all that kind of stuff that allows you to do those things using the subsets of data. But once you're done with that and you're happy with your result, we recommend that you use a job to run the full data set. And another note is to select a job cluster for new jobs, because serverless is the default and it wants to use serverless for that also. So to talk about scalability, one of the things I wanted to really touch on that I think is important to note is that if a lot of you are analysts, or you're doing, even if you're creating data sets that are for a client or for use or something like that, we usually run into this friction of the idea of the way the data needs to look at the end, and how the data needs to look for processing. And because Spark distributes work across a cluster, so we want to make sure that we facilitate that distributed processing whenever we're doing all the transformations and things with the data before we have our final product. And in traditional, workflows, you might have been used to doing things where you have that wide data set, and you're something that's a little more intuitive, kind of like this, where you have an ID, maybe this is some kind of encounter or visit or whatever, and then you have, diagnosis codes, maybe diag 1 through 25. And this is kind of an intuitive thing, because okay, one encounter that's, looks kind of like this in the real world, and you can imagine it, and you've, probably experienced it yourself and that sort of thing. But we can't, the structure is great for analysis usually, but it's not as useful for distributed processing. So we kind of have this, I was calling it sort of an analyst mindset, and then we have this distributed mindset. So Spark's goal is that you want to break things into small chunks, and you want to be able to process those chunks at the same time, which means in parallel across a cluster. So my cluster isn't just one thing. It uses this whole like thing that allows my work to be broken up into little pieces. So one of those pieces is that your data are partitioned, the data frame is partitioned into different pieces, and those partitions can be processed by the different worker nodes. And then that means that those different worker nodes working on the same, not the same chunks, but the same types of chunks of your data at the same time, that makes Spark scalable. So the way that Spark distributes your work, like I said, is you have the table. Well, your data frame looks like a table, but it is not really a table. Even the tables in the catalog are not really a table. They've got this data structure under the hood that Spark uses to distribute your work. It adds lots of little steps in, and it does all kinds of things that you don't even have to think about. But also the data on disk look a little different. They're columnar. So even the catalog tables are saved as a Parquet file on disk, and there are other files that go into it, but that it's column oriented instead of row oriented, which is something that we might, naturally think about the data in the rows rather than in columns. So you have this partitioned data, and that partition is sent off basically to all these little worker nodes. So you have your driver, and then you have all your workers. And I'm saying executor and workers interchangeably, but don't get hung up on that. And each of your workers has a certain chunk of rows in your data, and it can do all the same things to each row in these chunks of rows. So for example, just as an example, we may have rows 1 through 100 in this worker node, and then this other one may have the next 100, and then you have the next 100, just to give you an idea of what that sort of looks like. But usually it's a lot more than just 100. So data frames are partitioned, again, to facilitate distributed processing. And like I said before, there are partitions for the data frame, but there are also partitions in the catalog. So if you use your database tables, the Unity catalog tables in the workspace, those have a partitioning on them, but it's a little different than this partitioning. They're they're a little different. And the partitions on your data frame control how this work is split across the cluster, across all these little worker nodes. So these are what get created when I have my cluster connected and I hit run. This, behind the scenes, it creates all these little workers to do the work. So to kind of show that really briefly, I have a little function just to show the partition. And I'm going to grab our large New York City motor vehicle crash data that's in CDR PSA community, which you have access to. And I'm just going to select everything from there. It's actually not big enough to go in more than one partition, so I'm forcing it. Don't do this. Here's a note, don't do this. But just to show you, I'm going to tell it, give me 4 buckets by crash date, basically. So it's going to partition the data into 4 groups, and it may appear that there is overlap, but there isn't any duplicate data here. It's just not ordered by crash date. So you can see when we run this under the hood, this RDD is actually the thing underneath that is this immutable data structure that Spark uses to do all of its magic. And what we do is we deal with the data frame, which is an abstraction on top of that. And the nice thing about Spark is that it handles so much for you under the hood that we don't have to specify anymore, and we used to, but they make things very easy for us these days. So the next thing I wanted to tell you about is the first kind of bit of advice is if you use Spark APIs for your distributed processing, if you use Spark APIs, then you will be doing distributed processing. So if you stick with PySpark, Sparkly-R, and Spark SQL, you're usually going to be in pretty good shape with your notebooks and stuff. If you keep your data frame as that PySpark data frame, like if you're a Python person, or Sparkly-R data frame if you're an R person, for as much of your processing as possible, that will avoid a lot of issues. However, there are things that you can do to help or hinder Spark in what it's doing. And we're going to talk about that, during this hour. These 3 things that I have listed here will take you away from being a PySpark data frame. If I say my PySpark data frame .2 pandas, that's going to make it a pandas data frame. It's not distributed anymore. And it's going to bring everything into the driver node. It's going to be just one node that is not distributed. And you want to keep things distributed until you really need the two pandas. So if you're using some kind of package that requires a pandas data frame for your analysis or something like that, then wait as long as you can to do pandas, because by the time you get to that point, your data frame should be small enough. Sometimes it's not, because of lots of reasons, but there are ways to get around using non-distributed means for things in most cases. So this diagram below kind of is to give you an idea of the overall application. So the Spark application, this is all the these are all the things that are kind of happening under the hood that you don't necessarily see or think about. So you have this driver program. It defines that RDD, that data structure that I told you about. And then it creates this DAG, which I'm not going to talk about today. It schedules the tasks. Those go to the worker nodes. There is a cluster manager that helps orchestrate all the things. And I'm not going to cover that either, but Databricks has one and it manages the clusters for you. Then you have your different worker nodes that have tasks on them, and they may have the data that are stored or cached things. And that's generally the big picture of it. And the whole notebook, whenever you write some kind of PySpark program in your notebook, that is one overarching Spark application. And that's something that you don't define in your notebook. If you were not in Databricks, if you were working outside of Databricks, you would probably have to explicitly say this step, but we don't have to because they do it for you. So Spark distributes small units of work to perform computations in parallel. And that's the big thing that I really want you to take away from this. The things that bring everything together into the driver node, like collect or two pandas, they undo that magic of distributed computing that you're able to do in Spark. And we want to keep using PySpark or sparklyr or Spark SQL, allow your work to get broken up for you into small pieces so that they can be worked on. And this is just kind of the overall general takeaway. And a lot of the little things that we're going to talk about, little tiny examples, are also going to help you do this. So Spark plans work before it runs it. This is another piece of the puzzle. And then it splits the data for efficiency. So this is adding a new thing and telling you something I already told you. We talked about how Spark divides up this work into partitions. Those partitions can go to different worker nodes. So what it does with those pieces is Spark creates a to-do list, the steps you submit to it. Like if you say, I want to recode something with column, I want to join two data frames together, I want to filter, I want to select, that creates a to-do list that it keeps track of in the execution plan. So its to-do list, and then it optimizes this list before running the commands. And if you want to remember this, so I have a grocery list in my kitchen, and anytime, we're running low on milk, let's write it on the list. My son remembers only to put his candy bars on the list, but not his important food for lunch. We're running out of Diet Cokes, something like that. And once this messy list of all kinds of different things it's never done, but once I need to go to the store, I take the list and I rewrite it. So that's me getting the to-do list. The steps are not run right away as they're compiled on my grocery list. But once I need to go, I will optimize my list by writing all of the items down in order of the aisles in the store. So, when we come through the door, I get my cart, I go through produce. So I want to put down the fruits and veggies first, and then I go through the dairy. So I write down the milk next and that sort of thing. So Spark does the same sort of process when it optimizes your commands that you send to it before it executes them. So this is called lazy execution. And that means that your transformations are not run right away. So that's with column, filter, where, join. And then once you trigger them, those are run. So the plan is triggered and executed when you call something like display, show, collect, like we said before. And we can view this plan that Spark says it's going to do. with the explain command. I'm going to skip over this because I'm going to tell you about it right here. So we have some code right here. Let's say, for example, I want to get the New York City motor vehicle crash data again. So I'm getting that into a data frame. I'm going to recode the location column. I'm going to do a filter for only the Queens boroughs. So I only want those rows, and then give me explain because I want to see what this is going to look like. So there's a whole lot that it spits out. It has 4 steps. The very first step here is at the bottom. So the first thing that it does may not say 1, but here it does because we made it, the execution plan is able to collect all of these things that we gathered, and it is going to select and filter at the same time. So if I had some kind of select statement, it would be doing this at this stage. So here you have your number 1, it's photo scan parquet, and then it has the data that I requested. And then it repeats it here. This is the section that tells you a little more. So here, if I had selected some specific columns, it would tell me something more here. But we have dictionary filters, borough equals Queens. So even though I put this filter down here after some other step, it is applying it to this read. And not just from reading from the data frame. It doesn't create the data frame with the rows except for Queens. It's reading directly from S3 in memory file. So it's not the data frame, it's reading from the disk where the catalog table is stored. And it's filtering it out there, which is way more efficient than if it created the data frame with every single row and then did the other things. So I wanted to point that specific thing out. But let's add an innocent little cache statement. Hopefully very soon you will see a presentation that addresses when it is good to use a cache statement. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to tell you, oh, here's a place where you could get in trouble by using one. So we have the same code. I just put in the middle, cache this data frame because maybe I want to use it a whole bunch of times as it is at that point. And then the count executes that the plan, and then do the filter. So I have the same code. Let's see what this looks like. Oops. So that has 10 steps, and it does not go in order. This one down here at the bottom is 3. That's the first thing it's doing. It's not doing reading from S3 with the filter like it was before. The filter happens, sorry, I'll show you to you up here. The filter happens on the data frame. So it does do with column when it reads from the S3 on disk. So I'm selecting this table and it goes to that S3 location and it gets that stuff from the files, but it does apply the recode there, and then it does the cache, and then it does a filter after that on a data frame. So it created and did all this stuff up here at the top with every single row in the data frame. And so if you're breaking up your execution plan and you have, billions of rows in your data frame that you don't need, maybe you don't need all those rows, that you may be breaking them up and doing unnecessary computation, and sometimes that can make your worker nodes fail. So some of your worker nodes may do okay, but you get to one that for some reason that particular one has is using too much memory because of this operation is not scaling, and then that can happen. That can trip you up in your programs. So you want to avoid breaking that execution lineage with frequent actions. Again, like when you're doing your development work, you're going to want to look at every single thing and do all of your quality checks as you're going along to make sure that, okay, I'm writing this code, this is doing what I want. I'm double checking that there's not any weird data or, outliers or anything like that. And you want to keep the transformations lazy as much as you can while you're doing your development work. But if you're doing it on a limited data set or like a sample, if you're able to do a sample and you don't have dependencies that can cause a join to fail or something somewhere in your workflow, if you have a small data frame that you're working with to test everything out, then you probably can get away with breaking up everything, if you wanted to, if you needed to check. But once you're done with that development work, I strongly recommend you remove all of the little displays and counts and, group by counts and things like that you might have in there checking your work, because you don't need them once you run production. Although I understand whenever a step fails, if you have something very big and a step fails, then you want to know like what happened. So there are places that you can put things in where you can see what happened. And also, if you write your code so it's scalable, that makes it easier for you to put things like counts and displays in the middle to see if something is still looking okay in production in a job or something like that. I'm scrolling past this. This is just a screenshot of what we talked about. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is now that we kind of have an idea of the environment we're working in and what is scaling and how does Spark work under the hood, I wanted to talk a little bit about, like, I'm calling it legacy logic patterns, because this may be things that we used to do that worked well with, other platforms, or what worked well in the past with smaller data or something like that. But now we can optimize them for distributed computing. So if you find yourself doing looping of any kind, you usually can avoid it. You almost always can avoid looping in your data. If you're looping through lists or dictionaries, there are certain cases, if I'm creating like a bunch of when statements that I use in a with column, that can make sense to create a loop to create that. Or if you have a loop to create a string that you're then going to use in a SQL query. There are times where even using a list of codes might make sense and that kind of thing. But I'll tell you some alternatives that you might want to consider. If you're creating numerous intermediate tables or views, that can break up your execution plan like we talked about. Splitting data frames apart and then recombining them. And by that, I mean more stacking than merging. So if you're breaking data frames apart into different rows, then that can kind of mess up what Spark is trying to do. It can fairly efficiently do that for you. But for example, one of the things, if you're a SAS person, you may have done is you have to do different data steps for different pieces of a data table. And then you have to stack them back together. But there are other things that we can do instead now. If you're merging wide code fields with code set lookup. So for example, when I showed that diag 1 through 25 at the very top, maybe I want to merge code labels for each of those, or if I want to take my diag and present on admission columns and do checks and flags for all 25 of those, or a flag that it involves all 25 of those. There's some different things that I can do so that I'm not looping through every column, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So again, allow your transformations to chain in the execution plan. So if you have, this is what I said, keeping things lazy, but this also means something else that you'll see in a second. If you have many small intermediate data sets, that's something that we used to do. It made sense you have a data set 1 and it did some things, data set 2, and then you check everything, data set 3 and 4. You may have had all these different little data sets one at a time that often involved looping and things like that, but we can avoid doing that now. So we can have this fewer data sets. I'm recommending, or I'm proposing this to you, that you may be able to minimize the number of intermediate data sets that you have, and then have a little more logic in between each one. And that gives you a longer execution plan, so Spark can optimize things for you in ways that you or I may not think about. So for example, the 4 data sets above, you could be doing something like this. Oh, I'm going to filter and select columns and create data set 1, or maybe I include some recodes in there with the with column. The window function can add aggregated group information to each row, but what we used to have to do sometimes, if you're a SAS person anyway, is that you would do a group by and then merge that back on. And I see people doing that in help desk tickets and stuff. So I know some people are still kind of thinking this way, and that's maybe your go-to, but you don't have to do that. You can use a window function instead. And then if you want to join some code set labels onto things, and then finally, maybe you write out the report and that executes your plan in production, because in development, you probably check each one of these things to see, what does this look like? What are the first, 10 rows of my data for women? What are the, what does a random sample of this part look like? And what do my recodes look like? And, my window function, did that count everything or flag everything like I'm expecting? So here I have an example of what I mean by chained. So this is the same code we had above for our execution plan, but instead of saying data frame equals this, and then data frame equals that, and then da-da-da, some of the things I've read say that chaining the things together, like I'm showing you here, where you have your spark.sql and then .filter immediately after. So remember, this slash means that you're still continuing your line. So this line is like, imagine it's like super long. And then I have my filter, my with column, and then maybe I have another with column, because you could chain a bunch of with columns together, and apparently that is more, it's able to optimize that better than if you have data frame equals with blah, blah, blah with column, data frame equals data frame with column, it like repeated after one after another. I believe this execution plan is the same as the one with the 4 steps above. But this is something I wanted to offer up to you guys, because I've read a lot of things that say this is more efficient to chain things as much as possible. And then intermediate data sets. So I feel like this is maybe the most important thing to discuss in this presentation, because I feel like it's the thing that is the biggest thing that we tend to do that breaks up our execution plan, and it causes people headaches, I think. So we have, we want to use views, or we want to write a table to the catalog or something like that. And it makes sense. I'm not knocking intermediate data sets at all, because they make logic a lot simpler. They definitely have a lot of really good uses. But things to remember are that if you have a lot of these, they can break up your execution plan. Your temp views are calculated, and I think just any view is calculated each time it's called. So it's not stored anywhere. It's recalculated every time. And then if you're writing data to a table, that can help if you have a lot of data and really big tables that you're working on with complex transformations. Sometimes writing to a table, and then you have to remember to drop it later, but that can help. And I wanted to tell you one of the things that Databricks optimizes its SQL very well, and they spend a lot of effort on that. So if there's anything you can push to SQL, so even this one up here, I would probably recommend, some of this stuff, these are pretty simple recodes. You could put them up here in this select statement. And I would, of course, recommend, as always, to select only the columns you need, and then put the filter up here too, because then you know what you need to do in here. And that can sometimes be a way of optimizing your code, is doing everything as much as possible in SQL, because Databricks optimizes it so well. And one of the things, if you want to create a table from a query, you can create or replace table, blah, 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 as, and then select, do some kind of select. So here I say, okay, select only the columns you need and only the rows you need, as just for this example. But if you're writing with a data frame, you can do something like this, where you have overwrite, say I want a delta table, because that offers history and some other things. And then you just save as that, whatever you name. And you can't talk about intermediate tables, I feel like, without talking about some kind of big plan, a big workflow, because I've been saying plan a lot. So now in this presentation, I've talked a lot about notebooks and just talking about what's in a notebook. But I know how complicated the stuff that you guys do, how complicated it is sometimes. So you may have many data sources that you're bringing into a project. You may have, several that are very big, and you need to plan and figure out how to put all of those together in a way that is scalable, so that you don't have to keep making a lot of changes to it, because some little piece here failed that you weren't, expecting. And here's just a way of thinking about it, maybe that that I'm hoping will help. I like these kind of thought exercises, and I always draw things out on paper. I find that that's really helpful because your brain, thinks differently whenever you write on paper versus doing a diagram. And there's a million different free diagramming tools online, and I'm sure even in the things that you already have available to you. So let's say, for example, you have data source A, B, and C, and you want to make a Databricks job workflow that puts a bunch of tasks together. And I know a lot of times we want to do the percent run, but sometimes I think it makes it more difficult to debug if you run into a problem with a big project that has a lot of notebooks together, and they're a little more difficult to see in a job. But if you have your notebooks individually as tasks within a job, so for example, maybe I have data source A and all of these boxes here that I have down to this one that's at an angle are in one notebook. And then I have data source B, and that's all down to here, and that's in one notebook, and then this is in a notebook. And those three things can run in parallel if I plan things properly. So then I can run this notebook and this notebook and this notebook at the same time. And then within those, I have things that are written in a scalable way so that within each of these jobs that are running, it's able to create all the worker nodes and bring all of the little pieces of the partitions and the data and the work into going horizontally scaling. So for example, you may have data source A, and then think about the things that you need to select and filter from there. And do you need everything? You may not need everything to start with. And then you may want to do only the transformations related to data source A. And then the reason that I say read in a lookup table here is because I wanted to tell you about when you have a really big project with a lot of data and a lot of objects that you're creating, and objects as in data frames and even lists and stuff like that. You want to read in and create those objects when you need them. So if I created all of my lookup tables and all of my variables and all of my lists up at the top, maybe I select and filter and then I do that, some of those things could get chucked before I need them later, because if I have so many things taking up the memory in my little worker nodes and the driver node and stuff, those things can push out stuff that's old and hasn't been used, because this is called garbage collection, where the objects that have been created and aren't used will get deleted when you create new things, because you only have a certain amount of memory. These worker nodes are very small, and it's funny that it's so much faster to have many little tiny computers instead of one really big computer, because there's only so much you can do to add to one single machine to make it a scale. But when you have many little ones, it just works out. The math works out, the maths, and it's very efficient that way most of the time. So read in the things as you need them. So not only do you have to think about what do I have coming in, what do I need to create at the end, but what do I need in the middle, and when is it appropriate to read it in the middle so that I don't lose it. And I know that can be kind of a pain, but there's different configuration kinds of things that you can do to make that easier, so you can see things in one place and that you're not thinking, oh, I don't know where I define this or where I define that. You can kind of write configurations and stuff. There's ways to make it more organized so that you don't feel like it's all over the place. But, read in the lookup table when you need it, and then do your lookup join, and then do whatever transformations are related to that lookup. And then at this point, if you have something very big, you may want to write a permanent intermediate table so that then another notebook and another task can pick it up, because you're not able to move or push a data frame from one task to another in a job, but you are able to read from the catalog or read from S3. If you want to save data in S3 storage, that can work too. But just remember to clean your stuff up, or at least have temp folders that make it easy for you to identify what's temporary, which of these files are these intermediate files, and what needs to get cleaned up when. That's part of this whole planning thing too. But then moving on to the next data source, you may have this data source B, so maybe for this example, you have claims data and you have to impute cost from another data source. And then, maybe your other thing is some kind of administrative data or a survey or, provider information from something, and you've got to do all these different things to each one. And you may have transformations that you only, care about whatever is within B, and transformations where you only care about what's in C and you don't care about everything joined together yet. So if you, then join the thing and you have a task that does, joins the data and then does transformations only related to those. Because the other thing is if you're bringing in too many things at once, your worker nodes can get overloaded with that too. Kind of like when I said reading in things as you need them. This is the same sort of thing. So if you're joining things together, and then that means you have, certain things in memory in this task within this job cluster, that's something to keep in mind. And so then, maybe you join this stuff and that stuff, and then you do transformations only related to that, and maybe you have a lookup join. And I know this is very simplified compared to some of the stuff you guys have to think about and do, but I hope this thought exercise is helpful. So I'm going to move on to kind of the looping issue, rethinking data structures. So you want to make sure that you're using the right data types and structures for the task. And I feel like this is really funny because if you're working in pandas, a lot of times people will say, oh, don't use a list or a dictionary if don't use a data frame if a list or a dictionary will do. And here I'm telling you the opposite. I'm going to say, if you're using a dictionary or a list, those aren't distributed. So use a data frame. Even if a list will do, the data frame may be able to scale better, and it may be able to be more efficient when you're processing your things. And the first example that I always think of is because I've had to deal with a lot of code value sets and code lists and stuff. So I used to do a lot of joining labels onto things. And for that kind of work, I find that having, the long data for your codes that you have in your, maybe an encounter or, whatever, and then joining on the labels to that either from a data frame or from another table, those two things that are kind of long is more efficient than looping through, diag 1 through 25. But you're not stuck if you've already got a workflow where you're kind of looping through those columns, and you have diag 1 through 25 and POA 1 through 25. You're not out of luck, because there's little steps that you can take where you may not have the resources to do like something that's a total rewrite for you guys, or whatever your project looks like, using things like reduce or coalesce. So this is a link to an office hour, SAS, retain, and array, and PySpark. And there are parts in here where I have example code that give you an idea of one way that you can do flags. So if you have a lot of wide columns that you need to think about together and create flags for, and if you're able to think about them, the 1 through 25 diags, if you're able to say, oh, I'm interested to know if this one thing is in any of them, then this exact code example will work for you. There's coalesce and reduce that can maybe help you. It could be something that you can think about. But if you're able to, try out the long format, and it even, well, I'll tell you that in a second. So it even works even if you think that you're adding so many extra steps of transforming stuff that you may be able to make the data long and do some things to it. And that will save you time when you think, oh, but I had to do so many steps to get it there. It might not be that bad. So here's an example of a long data frame where this is in CDR PSA community. This is conditions. So one of my colleagues, Lilith, put these great example data sets in here where it's health, kind of like healthcare data. So you can see something that looks a little more like what you would use. So here, this is just encounter IDs, and then there's codes and code labels, but I broke them up here just to show I'm, joining them on, because I'm going to show you something else in a second. So I have my code, I have my labels, and I'm just going to join them together as a left join. And I'm adding this code ID that wasn't there before either. That's in that code above. And the code ID is for another step too. So the encounter can have more than one code in it. And these codes are, they look kind of like one codes or something. But another join that you can do is a broadcast join. And I should have put shuffle up at the top of a term that I was going to talk about. So this is when there's a thing called a shuffle. So when you do joins, and also when you do order by, so if you want to sort your data or if you want to merge your data, you're probably going to trigger a shuffle to occur. That's when data are transferred between the different partitions. So we want to reduce shuffle. We want to make sure that Spark can deal with the data only in the little partitions without having to look anywhere else. And this is one way that you can do that. So a broadcast join takes here, for example, we're going to broadcast the code label data frame. So the thing that has our codes and their labels, I want those labels on my other data frame that's long. And I'm going to broadcast it, which means I copy this data frame to every single worker node. And that means there's no shuffle. So I can say, my long data frame dot join, broadcast this, and then give me this left join. So then I get the same result, and let's see, 28 seconds, and this one said, well, it's 2 seconds. Sometimes it will, since this is so small, that's probably why it, seemed longer to do the broadcast. But in some cases that will save you a lot of headache, because when you have a shuffle that occurs, then because these data are probably just in one partition, when you have a shuffle that occurs, it can take so long. It can make your code take way long. Okay, so the other thing that I mentioned was splitting up data frames and putting them back together. So the way that we would add transformations, sometimes we would have to split data up in different pieces. And I'm telling you to do that in a minute, but I'm splitting things up by columns. So if you split up the columns and put them back on, that's not as bad as if you are splitting it up by rows and then trying to stack them back. And you would think that wouldn't wouldn't be a big deal. But for this type of sort of environment, that it doesn't work as well as it used to. Like if you're a SAS person and you were stacking things, it's like, oh, yep, just stack it. So here I'm showing you how you can use a window function to avoid having to maybe do a group by and then merge it back on. This is an example where I'm taking a condition flag, I'm making a condition flag, and I'm just saying, okay, if I have these two codes and I want to just say if either of those are in this row, then give me a 1, otherwise give me a 0. Or sorry, not in this row, in this encounter, because we have multiple codes per encounter. So if this encounter has those codes and this one does not, then give me a 1. That one would be a 0. And then also I'm going to say, okay, so count over this window for me too, please. And it will give me a count of how many are in the encounter. So this encounter has 3 codes and it's on each row. So I basically get a group by without losing the rows in the data set. And this, I know this is something that we end up doing a lot. And here's my flag. So this encounter had 3 things, 3 codes, and then I had these 2 codes in it. Those are the ones I was looking at in that target list. So that's something to keep in mind, is that you can use these window functions and they're pretty efficient. Now I'm going to talk about an example, and I'll go through this one pretty quick. I'm sorry, I know I only have like 5 more minutes, but I'm going to tell you some code example of how to go from wide to long and back to wide again. So say I have part A data and I have diag 1 through 25 and then present on admission 1 through 25 and then my IDs. And maybe that's all I'm interested in for this part of what I'm doing. So I just want these to be long, which means I get multiple IDs and then I have each individual diagnosis and its corresponding present on admission flag code thing. And then maybe I do some transformations or joins, put on some code labels and things like that. And then I want to make it wide again, but I need to make it wide where I just take the diag and make it wide and then present on admission and make it wide. I wasn't able to successfully get it to do both at the same time, but this worked okay. I scaled this. I tested it on I can't remember, it's 3 or 4 years of part A data, and it still worked fine. I was able to put it back on the original data set and it worked okay. So to create that data frame, here's some code from my favorite data camp, one of our fall 2024 data camps where we got to learn about the part A data. And this is selecting only the rows I need. It's selecting only the columns I need. And then I'm going to melt it and make it wide to long. And here's the example with claims on how to do that. So I have multiple ID columns listed here. I don't know if I really need them. I'm not that familiar with these claims data. And then I'm creating this special structure that you should just be able to kind of copy this and do it for everything in there. So I have 1 through 25, 26 not inclusive. And you got to make sure to create, if this is important, this number. I'm calling it diag num because I have diag 1 through 25, and diag 1 has an important significance compared to 2 and 25 and everything. And I want to make sure that diag 1 still matches POA 1. Whenever I have my wide, I make it long, because the long I can lose that information of whether diag 1 is the first one. But that's why we have this diag num that makes sure that we know which one is the first one, which one's the second one, and all that stuff. So then we have these 2 steps down here, which you can probably just chain, and I didn't. I wanted to kind of show you. You can easily add in a display here and check for yourself what it looks like if you have access to this. If you don't, I would recommend you take this and test it out with something you do have access to see if this is, making something wide to long will work for you, if this makes it easy for you to check that now. So I have that structure, and I create this column here that has that special structure, and it contains all of these things in it. And I can use the explode command to recode this thing so that I get it to be long. And then my final thing, I can select and rename these things. So it's long still, like it was a second ago. And and then I'm able to, make this long and have a column name that makes sense. So for long to wide, this code I wrote and I wanted to share because I couldn't find anything that did this. And I actually asked Chat AI if it had any good ideas about what to do, if they had any better ideas, but it didn't give me anything that worked. So I thought I would try using a window function to take those, to order by the number, and then to take all of my things, and then to take all of this so I can make it from long to wide. And so you can enter in this long data frame, the IDs, and this one is just 1, but for the part A, I have the code here. It's commented out so that it's not accidentally run to show you anything. But what I did was I took this condition code and the code ID and I made that wide. So it was long. We looked at it. There were multiple codes per encounter, and now it's wide. One of the things to watch out for going from long to wide is if you're wide to long to wide is if your original data had diags that were all blank, then those will be gone and it'll look like your counts are off, but they're not. So you just have to be mindful of that. So to recap, I'm sorry I went through that last thing really quick. Working with Spark and staying in like a PySpark data frame is going to be the best way to get started. on making your code scalable. You know what you need, so try and add that at the very beginning as much as you can. Keep that data in Spark, let it do the heavy lifting. That job will run faster, scale better, and stay easier to maintain. And thank you so much. If there's stuff that I talked about or mentioned that you want to hear more about, I hope you'll stay and do the survey, and I'll hand it back to Laura. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. I am seeing one question in the chat. When do you want to partition your data explicitly? Should partition things to match your window function and group bys at the beginning?
Should you partition things to match? You probably don't need to do that. Even if your stuff does not match your partition, you can test it out to see if it works, because people's different data and different cluster configurations can make a difference in how things behave. But I wouldn't recommend that you partition your data. I did have a presentation where I showed how you can partition your data to create report printouts that you want that are like really fast. And so in that case, I would say, yeah, partition your data. But in general, I would say don't do it, or don't worry about it. But you could test it out if you had like a window function and you think it's going slow, and see, because sometimes it is very fast to partition something. So it may not hurt to do it, but it can, you can sit and wait a long time. I don't want to encourage anybody to like waste compute time or anything. So in general, as a blanket statement, I would say do not mess with partitioning, except for in a few cases. And I hope that answers your question, but I know I kind of didn't.